Hello, my name is Alden Jenks. This video is the second in a series in which I analyze each movement of Wolfgang Mozart's String Quartet number 14, Kirko listing 387. It's the first of 6 quartets that Mozart wrote and dedicated to his admired senior composer Joseph Haydn. It was written in 1782, when Mozart was the ripe age of 26 years old. In this video, I'll be talking about the second movement, the Minuet. You've probably heard that word, Minuet. I wonder what associations you may have with it. I assume you know it was a dance, and it is possible to actually recreate 18th and 17th century dances based on verbal descriptions and also diagrams, pictorial. Take a look. As you can see, it was an elegant and elevated form of flirting, a kind of courtship ritual. As such, the music had to be quite simple to follow. There would always be 3 beats to the measure. It's said that Mozart was an enthusiastic dancer as well as composer of minuets and of dances in a variety of forms, including over 100 minuets, many intended to be danced. At the same time that people danced the minuet, it was also being introduced into opera and other forms of instrumental music. And the minuet tended to be more complex in that context. For sure, members of Mozart's audience were not only familiar with the word, they were most likely had danced a minuet. Obviously, this particular minuet is not intended for dance, but its aristocratic and flirtatious background is nice to keep in mind as you listen to this suave and sweetly melancholy music. Before we dive into the details, here's an overview of the design of this minuet, a design which was entirely conventional at this time. What this sterile diagram is intended to tell us is that a number of measures of music called A is stated, then repeated, followed by another number of measures, B, which distractingly involves a reappearance of A. Then B is repeated. The so-called trio is called that simply because it used to be performed with 3 instruments. It is made up of a number of measures called C, which are repeated, then D, likewise repeated. Then A and B come back one more time. The minuet feels longer than it is, perhaps because of the repetitions built into its structure. In fact, by calculation of one performance, the Cleveland Quartet's YouTube recording, the duration of the movements is nearly identical. 7 minutes, 36 seconds, 7:37 seconds, 7:37, and the last movement, 7 minutes and 13 seconds. All right, let's look at the details. If you are acquainted with the first movement of this quartet, you will grasp immediately that in most respects, this is entirely different. At the same time, there are points in common. Both movements are in G major. That immediately creates continuity. But given that, the difference in the melodic material is striking. The first movement's opening melody, with its upward motion and lyrical and continuous character, is in sharp contrast to the downward and discontinuous character of the minuet theme. It is halting. There is a breathless quality to it. In the rests of the first violin part, the other instruments speak up briefly, and then they too descend from measure 1 to measure 2. Right now, let's listen to the first 10 measures, performed by the Quatuor Mozart. In the third and fourth measures, we hear only the first violin. Its breathless opening is replaced by an odd passage, simple quarter notes, but the sense of 3/4 meter is disturbed by the offset dynamics. In fact, you could make a case for a rewriting of these measures like this. What Mozart has written is sort of a hemiola, a musical procedure in which 2 groups of 3 beats are replaced by 3 groups of 2 beats, giving the effect of a shift between triple and duple meter. This doesn't really make sense either because of the dynamics, but one thing's for sure, you couldn't dance to it. There are precedents for this passage in the first movement, where we have already seen Mozart putting particular emphasis on the dynamics. But in these particular passages, the issue is how does the performer make these variations in loudness without changing bow direction? To play this involves a sort of bowing that we do see described in a manual for playing the violin written by Mozart's father, Leopold, in 1756. I'm grateful to cellist Monica Scott for these images. I don't want to give the impression that Mozart's emphasis on dynamics was an innovation. Far from it. We see quite elaborate instructions in quartets by Haydn, Boccherini, Mozart's friend Christian Kanabich, and many others. That being said, I don't know of a passage exactly like these, but there is a lot of 18th century string music. All right, back to the music. Balance above all. These sort of strange measures, 3 through 6, present in outline 2 ascending passages of continuous quarter notes, thus balancing or maybe providing an answer to the descending, discontinuous first 2 measures. And then, of course, these upward figures themselves have to be balanced, played downward, inverted by the cello. The restatement of the opening, beginning at measure 11, is considerably changed. Let's listen to the opening from the beginning and then the restatement. The ascending quarter notes are here played by the second violin, and when the viola joins in, it does so with contradictory dynamics, soft when violin 2 is loud, and loud when violin 2 is soft, and so forth, as pointed out with the circled dynamics here. I don't think we hear this. It's a kind of secret trick that only the performers and spies like us can enjoy. The first violin adds a slightly melancholy little figure over the chromatic ascent in the second violin. In the first movement development section, there is a strange area in which little scraps of music from earlier in the movement are recalled out of order. It seems to be happening here, not within but between movements, because something very like this melancholy figure was introduced late in the first movement at measure 114. And along the same line, Prefiguring the prominent chromatic scale we have seen several times already, there were many versions of it in the first movement. Here's just one of several. The chromatic scale is in fact pervasive in the minuet. We have already seen this version. I will point it out in subsequent appearances. Before we go any further, we need to complicate our ABCD diagram a bit. What in the second 10 measures of A1 starts out as a restatement of the opening is actually part of a transit of the key center from G to D. Let's listen to the second half of A1 all the way through to the arrival on the dominant of D, the A major chord. Notice the balancing act here. In terms of measures, section A1 is made up of 2 equal lengths, 10 plus 10, and A1 and A2 are also equal length, both 20 measures. And Mozart performs this mathemagic while managing to modulate to the new key in the second 10 measures. Oh, I know, you didn't sign on to study math diagrams. But it wouldn't be quite right to protest, what does this have to do with music? Because, my dear, it has everything to do with it, so far as Mozart was concerned, and indeed as have measurements of a cathedral to do with the construction of the cathedral, and finally, the experience of the cathedral, or the experience of the Mona Lisa. The second part of A, this first half of the minuet, introduces a new idea. This brings up a topic that was touched upon in the analysis of the first movement, the cut and paste methodology of the classical style. There are innumerable examples of music from this period in which composers did exactly that. A bit of this, a bit of that, cute, charming, dum-de-dum, cadential formula, period. What we are seeing is how Mozart, always graceful and charming, resisted this simple solution and threaded throughout the music genetic code, bits of material that brought a movement or several movements together into a higher unity. Okay, as I said, the second part of A begins in D major with some new material. As at the opening, the first violin is speaking in phrases separated by rests, that breathless character, but drawn out, and in an extended sigh. And again, the lower instruments fill in the gaps left by the first violin. But let's back up. Remember the restatement of the first idea, the second 10 measures? It seems obvious that this new idea in D major is derived from the G major sigh in the restatement. Do you see? Note the interjections in the viola part in particular, because they lead to the introduction by the first violin of yet another new idea derived from this viola figure. In the following examples, the red rectangle is drawn around each appearance of this viola figure, with its characteristic chromatic downward movement. The blue rectangles point out what appears first as the concluding portion of the extended sigh figure that was introduced in the second half of the minuet. It is characteristically not chromatic. It is made up of portions of the D major scale. As the minuet nears its close, the downward chromatic figure appears in the three higher instruments until the major scale makes a reappearance, still with the blue rectangle around it, now going upward and acting as a kind of answer to the downward chromatic figure, straightening out its kinks, so to speak. Genetic code. This reminds us subliminally of this, the second theme of the first movement. Each is distinguished by a repeated emphasis upon a single note, in this case the same note, F sharp. All right, we've reached the end of the A section. This is then repeated, followed by the B section. Let's look at that now. What comes down must go up. At the outset of the B section, we hear the opening of the A section inverted. And this upward inversion is extended and extended in a prolonged arpeggio through all four instruments, outlining what at first sounds like a D7 chord. But at the peak, a D sharp is played, meaning that something is unresolved, undefined. Keep that arpeggio gesture in mind. Now, what goes up must come down to a temporary arrival in E minor, then moving on to D major. With all this rising and falling, have you noticed how continuous this is? None of the gaps, the breathless sighs we enjoyed in the first part, except, under the continuity, a couple of resigned downward trill figures. This continuity, well, continues over a 9-measure build-up, beginning on and in D, and ending on and in G. What follows is a wonderfully varied repeat of the A section, beginning and now ending in G. Does this remind us a little of the sonata form exposition, development, recapitulation design? There seems to be a familiar musical logic at work here. In the discussion of the first movement, I made the point that opera, the expressive style of opera, was a decisive influence in the development of what we call the classical style. There is evidence of this here as well. But at times I think of this minuet as not ballroom dance, but full-out ballet. A ballet for 4 instruments. A fanciful idea, I guess, but considering the expressivity of these wordless gestures. This is a phrase often used, musical gestures, but when I use that word, I think of arms and hands and legs gesturing. And considering how our attention has been drawn to the rhythm, it makes a kind of sense. The 6 limping downward notes of the opening, followed by 12 drunken notes staggering upward, a moment for the entrance of the full corps de ballet, and then the suddenly graceful movements of the first violin. The trio in 2 parts, each repeated. I think I spoke of melancholy as one attribute of this minuet. Here in the trio, it becomes explicit. The key changes from G major to G minor. The breathless, hesitant character we saw in places in the minuet predominates here. Note the many rests in the first violin part. There are some resemblances you might have noticed already between the trio and the minuet. Take a look. We already noted how the B section used the same rhythm as the A section, but the melody is inverted. Now the trio opening looks like a displaced version of the B section. I omitted the trills. And at the end of the extended arpeggio that comes after the first 2 measures of the B section, there appears a tendency tone, a note that can't be left unresolved, a kind of yearning. The same sort of a tendency tone appears in the trio opening as a quarter note. The stern opening gesture is countered by an expressive, unbroken line taking us in 8 measures to a half cadence, a less conclusive cadence, not on the tonic G minor harmony, but on the dominant D major. The opening 4 bars are then restated. This suggests that we are going to hear perhaps the entire 8 measures again, but we are not. Over a slowly rising line in the bass, the first violin carries on the trills of the opening, but the character of the music has changed to something like a bird's plaintive chirping until the pace of the harmony increases and we arrive at an unexpected cadence on B flat major. The arrival at this major key is a brief deception. If you recall the long arpeggio at the beginning of the minuet's B section. Now in the trio, the melody carries out in miniature this same gesture, leading us away from B flat major to the darker cadence on D minor. Here is a representation of this C section of the minuet, far less symmetrical than the minuet portion. Our D section begins with a passage that drifts away from D minor through C minor, passing through G minor, then finally to a cadence on a D major harmony, the dominant of G minor, preparation for a return of the opening of the trio, the C section. Now this is interesting. In the first half of the trio, virtually every significant gesture has been upward. Now in the second half, the D section, every gesture is downward. Just as the second half of the minuet, the B section, ended with a repeat of the A section, in the same way, here the C section returns as the last part of the D section of the trio. And in both there is no change of key. We begin and end in the key of G minor. Another change in the return of the C section of the trio is the extension of the 5-measure plaintive trill passage to 9 measures. Well, we have gotten into the deep weeds here, haven't we? This music, as I said at the start of the first movement, it's like that raindrop examined under a microscope that turns out to be populated by all kinds of novel creatures, and those under the electron microscope turn out to contain immeasurable worlds. William Blake, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Incidentally, if you like my approach to analysis and would like to work on some music with me, I teach in person as well as on the Zoom platform. Contact me through my website, www.aldenjenks.com. Please get in touch.